When Ralph Bakshi started making movies, he was the new hotshot of animation. His first two films, Fritz the Cat and Heavy Traffic, were unlike anything the world had ever seen. Not only were they X-rated, but they were also big hits that didn't even have to carry the Disney name in order to become successful animated films. Now, Ralph was off to a great start with his career. But then he would go on to create one movie that would ultimately derail him for the rest of his career. And as you will see, he will go and try to take a little detour in order to get back on track by going to Fantasyland. Now, you remember when I talked about Heavy Traffic and during production, he started to go to work on a new movie called Harlem Nights. But as you will see, the movie will go on to have a different title. Some of you may know it as one of the most controversial animated films ever created, but you might know it simply as Coonskin.
It's the story of three brothers, Brother Rabbit, Brother Bear, and Preacher Fox. They moved to Harlem after they sold their home and noticed that it wasn't the black paradise that they thought it would be. So, Brother Rabbit has a plan to become the new crime lord of Harlem so he could get rid of the scammers taking advantage of the people. But in order to do that, they would have to take down some powerful forces like a racist white cop and the Godfather and his cross-dressing sons. As you probably remember when I was talking about Heavy Traffic, the idea of this movie began when Ralph Bakshi was in the middle of making his second film. It all started when he met Al Ruddy, a producer who was fresh off of one of his biggest movies, The Godfather. After a nice little chat, they were talking about what could be Ralph's next movie. Since he didn't really have a plan, he only spontaneously said, Uncle Remus. And yet, that was enough to make a deal, and his next movie is now a go. On a side note, this would only be the second time that someone would make a film adaptation of the stories of Uncle Remus, even the second to do it by mixing live action with animation. The first was back in 1946 with Walt Disney's Song of the South. You know, the film that Disney doesn't want anybody to know about, yet they're somehow not afraid to always sing the movie's songs and use its characters very prominently in one of their most popular rides. But back onto Ralph's movie. Now that he's making his first picture without Steve Krantz, he can finally have all the freedom he wants to unleash his ultimate commentary. This time, he held nothing back, presenting them like how a selfish, bigoted white man would see them. For African Americans, they would have the entire blackface attire, complete with Uncle Toms and Mammies. The white boys don't get spared either, often presented as slimy and slick con men that only care about money, sex, and their own manlyhood. As for the gay guys, they prance around in the sluttiest outfits they could find on a girl and are thirsty for dick 24/7, even if it's their brothers. But you might be wondering, why? Why throw all these hateful stereotypes into this movie? You know the phrase, fight fire with fire, right? Bakshi took those stereotypes and made a mockery out of them. Sure, black folks look pretty bad here, but the crackers are represented far worse. Even presenting Miss America as this busty and manipulative seductress that's a metaphor of how America would often take advantage of the black man only to end up leaving him dead with blue balls.
You can take me. Come on, fella.
Oh, she got to clap.
While Ralph may not be attacking some of those he is stereotyping, the movie's biggest target to take down, however, is the Mafia. Bakshi is quite open about his distaste for the mob, and how movies like The Godfather portray these gangsters like they're people to admire. So, in the film, he presents them like filthy sewer rats with power, controlling everything through their lair in a run-down subway and making an empire of taking advantage of the working class. As you can tell, Bakshi was aiming to make a movie driven by shocking imagery used as symbolisms and metaphor to discuss his commentary on racism and organized crime. So, now that we understand what this movie is about, let's continue with the making of the feature itself. Unlike his previous films, Ralph had a prominent all-star cast. These include Philip Michael Thomas as Brother Rabbit, who would later star in the Miami Vice series, Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright and actor Charles Gordon as Preacher Fox, and legendary soul singer Barry White as Brother Bear. While they play the voices of the main characters, they also portray their human counterparts during the live-action segments, where it also features prolific actor and singer Scatman Crothers as Pappy, the movie's equivalent of Uncle Remus. Speaking of Crothers, Bakshi even wrote for him the song that was used in the opening of the movie called... Well, I'm too white to say it, so I'm gonna leave this here and you can fill in the rest. As for the Uncle Remus aspect, it's not just the characters that pay homage to the stories. There are also a few scenes that give a modern 1970s twist to some of Rabbit's tricks to get out of trouble.
Kick me down, ice pick me, do anything you want, but don't let my poor body fling through that open window and slap down hard on the concrete below. I'm begging you, don't throw me out that window. 'Cause I was born and raised in a garbage can.
As production moved on, the title would go through a few changes in order to make a stronger impact of what this movie is about. Coonskin No More was a good contender, but they decided to keep it simple to have it be more eye-catching and shorten it to Coonskin. Now, you'd think that without his producer Krantz, things would be a lot easier for Ralph, right? Well, maybe during the production with the strong support of Ruddy, which helped get the film a nice distribution deal with Paramount Pictures, but when the movie had its first viewing on January of 1975, this is the part where the story gets chaotic. Like with Fritz the Cat and Heavy Traffic, the movie premiered at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. However, the Congress of Racial Equality, aka CORE, was ready to march in to protest it. Why? Well, despite that, literally no one saw it, and I think one guy might have read the script, maybe, I'm not really sure. This movie uses blackface, and that is not okay! When the Q&A session began after the film, the head of the group, Al Sharpton, was ready to blow out Bakshi with questions, while Ralph did his best to keep his cool and stand his ground that he did nothing wrong with the movie. Some could say that it was a moment that made a wild night to remember at the museum. But even after the premiere, CORE was still determined to take this movie down, even if Paramount and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People were on the film side. Soon afterwards, CORE was surrounding the Paramount building in New York, still furious of the existence of Coonskin. Luckily though, Al Ruddy had a plan to help out both the distributors and the movie itself. He convinced Paramount to let go of Coonskin so that they won't have to deal with the burden of the film's drama, and replace the distribution rights to the Bryanston Distribution Company, the same people that released the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. By the way, there is a huge sense of irony with the new distributors, since they were actually run by the Mafia. So imagine this. A distribution company organized by the mob released a film from the producer of The Godfather that's an entire slam on the Mafia. How weird that Coonskin was saved by the same people it tried to destroy. Anyways, when the switch was made, Ralph made a few adjustments to the movie in order to take off some of the things that might have crossed the line. Not to please the people at CORE, just to remove some of the unnecessary swearing. Once the new version was settled, the film finally opened to the public with a limited release on August 20th, 1975. However, the movie's troubles were far from over. CORE would continue trying to sabotage the picture, even going as far as throwing smoke bombs in the theaters to get people out from watching the movie. Some even say that Martin Scorsese saw it happen while he was filming Taxi Driver. But if you think CORE was crazy with how they reacted over a film they've never seen, you'll see that the other side of the political spectrum can be just as nuts. During its run, Bakshi was getting congratulatory calls and cheers from Republican politicians, Hollywood elites, right-wing conglomerates, and even extremist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. all because they thought he made an anti-black movie. But despite what any of those people think, if you ask critics who did see it, they will tell you that they love it. Okay, maybe not all, but the praise did come from the big publishers. Like the New York Times stated, Coonskin could be his masterpiece. A shattering successful effort to use an uncommon form, cartoon and live action combined, to convey the hallucinatory violence and frustration of American city life, specifically black city life. Lyrically violent, yet in no way does it exploit violence. While the film may have died off at the box office, it would eventually grow a cult status, and many would put this among Bakshi's greats. Even the Online Film Critics Society ranked it at number 97 on their top 100 animated features of all time in 2003, and at number 85 on Time Out's top 100 best animated films in 2014. While it may have the reputation of one of the most controversial animated films, the best way to summarize Coonskin and its history is with a few words from the bottom of its 1987 VHS, where the title was somehow changed to Street Fight, where it warns that this film offends everybody. When he was done with Coonskin, Ralph decided that he wanted to explore a concept that he only touched upon with that film, blending hand-drawn animation with live action. This was the motivation that prompted him to create his next movie, Hey Good Lookin'. He had a good deal with Warner Brothers when they greenlit the project back in 1973, but after the insanity that happened with Coonskin and believing that doing this mix of live action and animation won't sell, the company decided to bail out and stop funding his movie. This ultimately left Bakshi in a tough spot. Not only did Hey Good Lookin' lost its funding and distributor, but Ralph's reputation also got a nasty gunshot wound. I mean, what company would want to help fund an animated movie made by a loose cannon who always fills his work with sex, gratuitous violence, and depictions of black stereotypes that might end up resulting in public outrage? It's too much of a risk to take. With that in mind, Ralph knew that he had to change the pace of his career. In order to counter that mindset of how people perceive him, he had to leave the ghetto environment of his films and step back into a place that he had always immersed himself when doodling as a teenager. And that is the realm of fantasy. So in 1976, he went to 20th Century Fox and pitched his idea for his first fantasy film, Wizards. Set millions of years after today, the world is now inhabited by mythical creatures and mutants who have been deformed by the radioactive environment that consumed the Earth. Avatar, one of the sons of the Queen of the Fairies, set off with his friends, including a fairy in training named Eleanor, an elf warrior named Weehawk, and a robot assassin turned good named Peace, to confront his evil brother Black Wolf, who seeks to dominate the world with his mutants and take down the magical beings using military weapons and an old projector showing Nazi propaganda. Now Avatar and the gang have to stop Black Wolf's army and end the war of magic versus machines. The biggest goal for Ralph Bakshi with this film was to show that not only was he capable of making movies set outside of the streets of New York, but to also prove to everyone that he can make a family picture.
This is my first kids film, my family film.
Whether if he was successful at it can be highly debatable, but at least we can all agree that he did try. The idea for the film actually started before Ralph was making movies. He had a pitch for a TV show to CBS in 1967 called T-Wit, made with the help of his Terrytoon friends Cosmo Anzalotti and Johnny Zago, which ended up not getting picked up. However, the show never went away in his mind, and some elements would find itself onto the movie, which took him just 2 weeks to write the script that he then called War Wizards. For the feature's commentary, Ralph wanted to go a little more personal that he and his family actually went through, and that is the dangers of propaganda. how it can be a dangerous weapon that can be used to motivate twisted-minded extremists like Nazis and white nationalists and traumatize others in order to ultimately destroy democracy to make room for fascism. This was why the Bakshis had to flee Palestine and move to Brownsville, because the Nazis were taking over and exterminating Jewish families like them. Another message he wanted to convey in the movie is the use of technology, and how, in the literal form here, using too much of it will kill off the magic that surrounds us. For the look of the film, Ralph didn't want to stick with just one visual style. He wanted to present a clear difference between the magical world of Mordegar and the dark lands of Scorch. This was achieved by hiring British illustrator Ian Miller to create the massively detailed backgrounds of Scorch and comic book artist Mike Ploog for the designs, the Mordegarian landscapes, and the monochrome illustrations seen throughout the film. When he was close to finishing the feature, Ralph ended up using all the budget due to the animator's salary boost. He decided to check on then president of Fox, Alan Ladd Jr., to ask him to increase the budget. But not by much though, he only needed an extra $50,000. However, Ladd just flat out told him no. Coincidentally, he was in the same room with another filmmaker who was rejected for some extra cash for his movie since it went over budget, and that was George Lucas when he was making Star Wars. At that point, the two ended up leaving with a compromise with Ladd. They accepted that the rest of the film would have to be funded through their own pockets, but they ended up owning the rights to their franchise, merchandising, and some good back-end stakes. By the way, this wouldn't be the only connection between Wizards and Star Wars, along with the relationship between Bakshi and Lucas. Considering how both films were released a few months from each other, George asked Ralph to change the title from War Wizards to simply Wizards, so that people won't get too confused with two movies released by Fox that have war in the title, which Bakshi agreed. Also, during the making of both films, George accepted to let one of his actors to be in Ralph's film for his first voiceover role as Sean, the son of the King of the Mountain Fairies, which would later lead to the very prominent voice acting career of Mark Hamill.
Please accept our apologies for the behavior of some of our more carefree brothers. I'm Sean, leader of the Knights of Stardust, protectors of Dolan, King of the Mountain Fairies.
Another notable voice actor in this movie is Susan Tyrrell, who was the narrator of the film.
An illuminating history bearing on the everlasting struggle for world supremacy, fought between the powers of technology and magic.
At first, she asked if she would have her name be removed from the credits, since she was a little embarrassed to be associated with an animated film. But then years after the movie's release, she changed her mind because she had gotten more jobs for that narration role more than anything else in her career. But back onto Ralph's money trouble, he had to find a cheap alternative in order to finish off the battle sequences. His solution would be a technique that would later commonly be associated with his animation style, rotoscoping, the art of taking live-action footage, tracing each frame, and put it all together to capture some realistic effects in a piece of animation. Think of it as a cheat sheet, if you will. With that in mind, he went and combined several fight scenes from stock footage and films like Sergei Eisenstein's Alexander Nevsky and used the rotoscope technique to have those clips fit within the stylistic world of Wizards. When it was released on February 9th, 1977, it came in with good news and bad news. The bad news was that there was one more connection between this movie and Star Wars. When George Lucas's film came out, it was absolutely massive. So much so that it even overshadowed Wizards, and Fox had to pull out the animated film to make room for the galaxy far, far away, losing its chance to be something far bigger than it is now. The good news, however, is that for the small amount of theaters that did have Wizards, the movie was a massive hit. It may have gotten some mixed reviews from critics, but audiences who saw it loved Ralph's new and original fantasy world. In fact, the movie has since become a pop culture icon, where even the picture of Peace riding on an alien horse creature can be considered the most recognizable image from Bakshi. There are even some music artists that would sample the movie's audio for their albums, like Cypress Hill's Skull and Bones and for Toxic's Think This, Vanilla Ice Platinum Underground, and 65 Days of Static's Volume 1, Then We Take Japan. Originally, Ralph wanted to create a Wizards trilogy, but even if that plan never came to be, he had made attempts to create a sequel, whether it be as a movie or in comic form. One plotline he mentioned would be about Avatar and Eleanor's relationship and how Weehawk would get in the way. But regardless if the movie would have a sequel or not, it will nonetheless have a bright future ahead, as the legacy of Wizards will still be strong as a cult favorite. While his first fantasy film was entirely original, his next feature would take people to the very familiar land of Middle-earth with The Lord of the Rings, based on the epic novels by J.R.R. Tolkien. It's the story of Frodo Baggins, a hobbit that received a powerful ring from his relative Bilbo. His old friend, a wizard named Gandalf, warned him about the great powers that it holds, and that it should never fall into the hands of evil, especially to the Dark Lord Sauron. After having a big council regarding what to do with it, everyone agreed that it should be destroyed inside a volcano in Mordor. So now Frodo, Gandalf, and his friends, Sam, Merry, and Pippin, set off with a team of warriors, elves, and dwarves to avoid Sauron's army and destroy the One Ring to save all of Middle-earth. Nowadays, we all recognize The Lord of the Rings as one of the biggest fantasy franchises in history that can dominate every medium it touches. However, during its beginnings, when it was only known as a trilogy of novels, many would say that it would be impossible to turn those books into a movie. In 1969, Tolkien sold the film rights of his novels to United Artists. At the time, the Beatles wanted to be a part of the film as the stars and even planned on who would play who. Paul McCartney would have been Frodo, Ringo Starr would have been Sam, George Harrison would have played Gandalf, and John Lennon would end up as Gollum. They even approached Stanley Kubrick to be the director. Too bad that he's one of those people that believe that a film adaptation can't be done, and since Tolkien was completely against having his story starring the Fab Four, that whole plan had to be scrapped. It wouldn't be until 3 years later in 1976 when United Artists paid $3 million to filmmaker John Boorman to write a Lord of the Rings movie. The result is a 700-page script that combined all 3 novels into one film, where many of Tolkien's characters are different from the books and included new ones. With this new script in hand, what was once considered impossible to take the novels and turn it into a movie is now still valid to this day. I mean, seriously? 3 giant books crammed up into one film with a script that's 700 pages long? I had to check. The average movie script is said to be around 120 pages. Unless that thing is like 12 hours long or something, there is no way you can do that in one big shot without making it entirely confusing. One morning, Ralph Bakshi saw the news about United Artists' new script, and he immediately called for a meeting. You see, ever since he started out at Terrytoons, Ralph was a huge fan of the novels, and he always believed that the story could be turned into an amazing animated feature. So at UA, since they couldn't understand a single thing from John Boorman's script, they agreed to let Bakshi take charge of the movie. His first step was to go to MGM and meet up with then-President Dan Melnick so that they can pay UA the $3 million they spent on the wasted script. Once everything was settled, Ralph was ready to go and start making his new movie. That is until Melnick was replaced by Dick Shepherd as the new MGM president and scrapped the project.
Fool of a took! Throw yourself in next time! You fool of a dick!
Okay, let's go to plan B. Instead of MGM, he went to the man who helped him finance Fritz the Cat, Saul Zaentz, whose company, Fantasy Films, was fresh off of having a major hit with the film adaptation of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which he agreed to help Ralph like he did before. Soon afterwards, he had one more person he needed to see in order to get the full approval of making a Lord of the Rings movie, and that is Priscilla Ann Rule, the daughter of J.R.R. Tolkien. Ralph promised her that his film would be as faithful to the books as possible, and she gave him her blessing. She even let him check out her father's writing studio. With the movie officially in place to be made, Ralph's first big obstacle was to execute this epic story as an animated film. He knew that he couldn't just make some cartoony-looking Lord of the Rings if he wants to maintain the serious tone from the novels. This is why he decided to take the rotoscoping technique he used to make some of the scenes from Wizards and use that to animate almost the entire movie, which means that he would have to film it as a straightforward live-action film first, then get the animation crew to draw the camera footage so that the visuals can capture that realistic look. And so the production began by going to Spain in order to shoot the live-action references where the actors are all dressed up as the characters. Speaking of which, some of the actors that were used for the live-action shots were also the voice of their respective characters, while others, however, had their characters be voiced by someone else, like John Hurd as Aragorn, the brothers Christopher and Dominic Guard as Frodo and Pippin respectively, and Anthony Daniels as Legolas. Oh, hey look, another Bakshi Star Wars connection. There was even at one point, Rolling Stones singer Mick Jagger was close to getting a part when the crew invited him to check out the studio. Anyways, sometimes filming wouldn't go as planned for Ralph. He would have trouble working around the Spanish union bosses where they would always stop everything to give the actors a break. There was even one time when all the orcs had to call out for lunch and Ralph secretly filmed them on their path to get some food and actually used that footage in the film. Wait, is it lunchtime? Wait, is that the segment? Oh, we're finally getting
that segment was absolutely tiresome.
Now, dealing with other people's work schedule is one thing, but there was even at one point that the Spanish people almost destroyed the entire film. When checking out the footage at the film development lab, they nearly incinerated everything that Ralph shot because they felt that the cinematography was sloppy. They don't mean by his filmmaking skills, but more like the shots had things that a medieval fantasy setting shouldn't have in the backgrounds, like telephone lines, helicopters, and cars driving by. Guess they didn't get the memo that Ralph had a plan to get rid of those in the final film by animating them out because they wanted to get rid of it in fear that it would scare Hollywood away from doing business with Spain. But going back into the animation, Bakshi originally intended to have some scenes to be naturally animated instead of rotoscope like the battle between Gandalf and the Balrog, but they were mostly scrapped in favor of keeping everything in tune with the realistic movements. The only scene in the film that wasn't rotoscope was when Merry and Pippin interacted with Treebeard.
Cut our rope, ran into the forest, and we came to your hill, and...
Hill? Ooh. A hasty word for something that has stood here since the world was shaped.
After the filming was complete, Ralph had to face another big obstacle. The price of printing each frame of film for the animators to draw over it was a whole lot bigger than before, and he didn't have a lot of the budget left. What's more, he was looking for something better than what he used in Wizards because he needed the details to be clear so that the movie can have those well-drawn looking characters. This was when he called in camera technician Ted Bemiller to create a special photographic enlarger that is capable of holding an image and enlarge it enough to fit in a sheet of photography paper without spending too much money. It also helped when they got a sweet deal with Kodak when they could buy photography paper at 85 cents each. Another money-saving tactic he used was on the special effects, where instead of hiring specialized animators to do it, Ralph utilized real-life effects, real lighting sources, and analog optics, which also helps convey the realism he was aiming for. Originally, Bakshi wanted the songs of Led Zeppelin to be the soundtrack of the film, since some of their songs were based on Tolkien's stories, like Ramble On and The Battle of Evermore.
This is to stay for tea and have some fun. Oh, oh, oh. You said that it's free. The evil one crept up and slipped away with yeah.
However, since they couldn't get the rights to the music, the producers and Ralph Bakshi had to settle with an original score by Leonard Rosenman. In total, the length of the feature is 133 minutes, or 2 hours and 13 minutes, making this the longest American animated feature to date, with Walt Disney's Fantasia at a close second with 125 minutes. While it is impossible to adapt all 3 books into one movie, Ralph and United Artists agreed to split the saga into 2, where this film would tell the events of the Fellowship of the Ring and the Two Towers, while the potential second part would be about the Return of the King. Bakshi tried hard to give it the title The Lord of the Rings Part 1, since the movie didn't finish the entire story. However, UA didn't care what Ralph wanted. Not only did they took off the Part 1 so that audiences wouldn't think this is only half a movie, but they also declined his request to have more time to finish the film because they want this to be out early in the holiday season no matter what. The Lord of the Rings was released on November 15th, 1978 on a $4 million budget. The film was a financial success by making $30.5 million at the box office. As for the critics, they all had mixed feelings for the feature. I mean, yeah, it ain't like how Tolkien wrote it, but the faithfulness and the unique animation does leave something to admire. Unfortunately, Tolkien fans reacted exactly how Bakshi expected when the film didn't have its Part 1 title. They were more disappointed that they didn't get the whole story and that some significant characters were cut from the film. However, as time would move on, the movie would end up leaving more a positive impact. The film would receive several nominations, including for a Hugo Award, a Saturn Award, and a Golden Globe for Best Original Score. It would also get a Golden Griffin Award during the Gifoni Film Festival. It would also find itself on a couple of lists for the best animated movies, like at number 90 in the Online Film Critics Society's Top 100 Animated Features in 2003, at number 36 in Time Out's 50 Greatest Animated Films in 2009, and at number 80 in their updated Top 100 list in 2014. 2 years after the movie's release, Rankin Bass, who already created the 1977 animated TV special of The Hobbit, stepped in to finish the animated saga with The Return of the King. And funny enough, the Tolkien fans suddenly have a change of tune about the Bakshi film.
Where there's a whip, there's a way. Where there's a whip, there's a way. Where there's a whip, we don't want to go to war today. But the Lord of the Lashes says, nay, nay, nay. We're gonna march all day, all day, all day.
You know what? Maybe that Ralph Bakshi film wasn't actually that bad after all. I mean, it actually is faithful to the books, it did take itself seriously, and certainly looks a lot better than whatever the hell this is. Maybe I should give that film a second chance. Hey, where's that DVD of it? Oh, wait a minute. Wow, I almost forgot. They're not invented yet.
But if it did leave one important legacy, is that it proved to the world that a film adaptation of The Lord of the Rings is possible. And the movie was a key inspiration for Peter Jackson to create his legendary trilogy. In fact, there are several scenes that pay homage to the Ralph Bakshi film.
Brace girdles, good bodies, bulges, horn blowers, and proud foots. Proud feet.
Soldiers! Brace girdles! Proud foots.
But even without a part 2, the movie would forever live on as the animated film that paved the way to have The Lord of the Rings to become the one fantasy franchise to rule them all.
Oh, my. Oh.